There are lots of things that I believe. When people ask me, what do? I tell them I'm an economist. But when I think of myself as an educator, I ask myself, am I an economist educator or an educator who happens to talk about economics? And I think that in order for us to be successful as economics educators, we have to be first and foremost successful as educators. What does it mean to be a successful educator? I was at a workshop recently where when people asked what they thought their role was as an educator, the popular answer was, I'm a tour guide. And I thought to myself, that's way too passive, because what we want for our students, what I think we all want for our students, is for our students to learn to be able to think like economists, and not just to think like economists during the semester. We want them to think like an economist when they're outside of the classroom, and we want them to think like economists for the rest of their lives. How do we structure an environment so that we can be successful as educators? One of the things that I believe is that if we want our students not to be tourists, but to become the tour guides for themselves later on, we need to be very careful about how the journey that they take is structured. You need to know where you are starting, and if you're going to be creating a map, you need to know where you're going to be ending. And if you're going to be stopping off at certain points along the way to point out interesting features, it's important to know why those features are interesting. If we don't do that, I don't think the education research indicates that it's possible for us to truly engage our students. I start my semester off, my class off, with what we call the central question. This will be familiar to those of you who are aware of the literature on critical thinking. And I repeat this question throughout the semester. And the central question that I have seems pretty obvious, which is, when you walk into a store, you can find the things that you want to buy at the price that you're willing to pay for it. How did that happen? I don't think people expect that to be what an economics class will be about. But in the end, it allows me to give the students something to hold on to. It gives them something to think about as we are moving along in the semester, and they know where we are going to end. And they can see how each part of the storyline fits together into a complete and whole narrative. In order for the students to understand how we end up with the things in our stores, I introduce what we call the fundamental and powerful concepts. The fundamental and powerful concepts that I use in my intro class is I talk about choice. People are always making choices. If they're not happy with their choice, they'll make a different choice. The outcome of these different choices that producers and consumers make, we call that an equilibrium. If we can understand the concept of an equilibrium, then we can understand something that's deep about the way that people interact with each other. And we also want to be able to judge whether or not the equilibrium outcomes that we see are good outcomes. Are they efficient outcomes? If we can get our students to understand that people are making choices, and it's important to understand that if you don't like your choice, you will change, then we can get our students to see that every time people are making a choice, they're making the same kind of a choice. A story that I use with my students is I ask them, imagine that there's a high-toned film. And the example that I had used a few years ago was The King's Speech. And I said, suppose you're a fan of high-toned movies, and you're standing online to see a high-toned film. Will you necessarily go see the movie? And the answer, of course, is, well, maybe, if you're willing to pay the price for it. Which means the students need to focus on benefits and costs. And they need to see that we focus on benefits and costs not just in one place in the course. We focus on it from the first day to the second day. Every single day we focus on benefits and costs. Every day I give them another small, tiny question and ask them to try to see how each question fits in with the previous one. About 20 years ago or so, when I was first on the job market, I gave a talk for an introductory economics class. And I presented what I thought was a really neat little lecture on the relationship between investment and savings and trade flows, and I thought I had a great punchline. I was able to explain how my model, how my story helped us understand what was going on in England with their balance of payments crises. I thought this was very neat. Start with nothing, end with something. Lovely. The dean of the college spoke to me afterwards, and he said, that was a nice talk, but it would have been more effective if you had started off by saying, there's this interesting fact in the world, and I'm going to try to explain it. And the way to do it is by focusing on the relationship between investment and savings. In other words, we start with the question at the beginning of the lecture. We start with the question at the beginning of the course, and we ask, how does our story, how does our analysis get us along to where we want to be along the way? What's the important concept, and why do we need it? If we can do that, then our students can walk away from the course as people who are capable of thinking like economists for the rest of their lives. This is what I believe we all need to do as economic educators. We need to find what is our central question. We need to reinforce that question throughout. We need to ask our students that question, and we need to get them to write about it so that they have considered it and put it all together. That way, they'll be critical thinkers as economists for the rest of their lives.